Welcome to episode 2 of DIY or BUI, a series where you send me clothes from the internet, I try to make it, and then I let you know if it's worth the time or if it's worth the money. A few weeks ago, I posted a poll asking you which one of these things you'd like to see me try to make, and most of you voted for this skirt. So today, I'll be trying to make it.
I'm starting with this velvet dress that I thrifted for $8.
I think this is going to be a pretty easy project, but the thing that I am a bit worried about is the waistband and just having enough fabric as a whole. The first thing that I want to do is cut straight across underneath the armholes so that I can get as much fabric as I can. Okay, so let's take some measurements. I'm going to measure my waist measurement. Girl, she ashy. Wait, let me put some lotion on. Okay, that's better because I was so dry. Anyway.
Waist is 32, hips is 40 inches, length is 14 inches.
And then I'm going to put them all together and see what I get. I'm going to create a pattern that looks like this on fold. The width of the pattern is going to be 8 inches because we have 32 for the full waist divided by 4 is 8. And then the total length is going to be 17 3/4 because the length from the waist to the top of the ruffle is 14 inches. Because we want a gathered effect, we're going to multiply by 1.5. If you want it to be more of a dramatic gathering, you could do 2 to 3 inches instead of 1.5. So 14 times 1.5 is 15.5. Then I'm going to be using an elastic waistband. So I added 2 1/4 because that is my waistband times 2 plus 1/4 inch for seam allowance. So 15.5 plus 2 1/4 leaves me with 17 3/4, which will be the total length. And then the width for the bottom, which will be the hip width, divided by 4, which will be 10 inches. And then I'm going to make this pattern on the fold, and I'm going to cut 2 pieces, one for the front and one for the back.
I wanted to use the bottom part of the fabric to make the ruffle. So I just measured the full length of the skirt, which is 17 3/4. But I just rounded it up to 18 inches. And then I made a mark along the 18-inch measurement all across the fabric. And then after that, I just cut along the measurement so that I could use the top half for the skirt, the body of the skirt, and then this bottom half would be for the ruffle. I'm going to put this piece of fabric aside to make the ruffle later, and then I'm going to cut down along both sides of the fabric where the seam is so that I can create 2 separate pieces. I'm going to put one of the pieces aside for later, but for now I'm going to take the other piece and I'm going to fold it in half so that the wrong side is on the top of the fold, and I'm just going to transfer my measurements over to the fabric. So I'm transferring the full length of the skirt as well as the hip measurement and the waist measurement, and then I connected all of the lines so that I could have a shape like this. So this is what the skirt pattern looked like after I drew it out on the fabric, and I'm sorry it's so blurry. Since this fabric is stretchy, I didn't add any seam allowance lines to the outside of the pattern. Instead, the seam allowance line will be in the inside. After that, I pinned down the fabric and I cut along the lines. Then I took the other piece of fabric and I repeated the previous steps. And so I had 2 pieces like this, and I unpinned both pieces and I stacked them on top of each other with right sides facing. And then I just pinned along the seam allowance line with a safety pin. So it looked like this, and I also folded over the top edge where the elastic would go. And I'm just going to try it on.
Okay. So this is what it's looking like. I have the safety pins inside. I thought it was going to be too big, but the stretch is perfect. And I think the length is good because remember, I'm going to be gathering it on the sides. So once I gather it, it'll actually be shorter. Yeah, feeling pretty good about this. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to stitch together one side.
Then my straight stitches came out like this, and after that I cut down the seam allowance so that it was about 1/8 of an inch, and that's because I don't want it to be too bulky once I add the elastic. Then I took the bottom portion of my shirt that I had put aside earlier, and I measured and marked 2.5 inches, and that's going to be for my ruffle. And I took the tube and I cut it along the seam allowance so that I could have one long strip of fabric. So with this other piece of fabric, I'm going to make a copy of the first piece of fabric so that I can put the two pieces together to have a lot of fabric to make my ruffle.
Okay, so this is what the fabric is looking like now that I've pieced together those two pieces of fabric that I showed you in the previous clip. I know that this is going to be way too much fabric, but I'd rather have more fabric than less. I'm going to use my ruffle foot and I'm going to gather all of this. Let's do it. Alright, so this is what the ruffle is looking like right now. I already started adjusting it because the way it was when I took it out from the machine was like super tight, like this kind of. I've just been kind of like tugging at it and like pulling it to just kind of like make it a little less tight so that the overall length or width is long enough to cover the full bottom of the skirt. I opened up the skirt pattern so that it's one long panel. Remember before I had it safety pinned on both sides? So now that it's one long panel, I took the ruffle and I turned it upside down so that the top edge of the ruffle is now at the bottom. And I put the ruffle on top of the skirt pattern so that the right sides of the skirt pattern and the right side of the ruffle are touching each other. And I pinned it down in place. And now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the ruffle onto the bottom edge of the skirt. And I'm just going to do a straight stitch all along the seam allowance line that's on the ruffle. And yeah, let's go do it. So this is what the ruffle is looking like now that I finished it. I did go ahead and serge the raw edge all along the bottom so it looks more professional and clean. I'm loving how it looks so far.
I'm loving it.
I'm just going to close up the skirt and I'm going to do that by just folding it so that it's folded in half. I don't know how else to say that. The side seam is here that I did earlier. I'm just going to do a straight stitch along the seam allowance line on this side of the skirt. I'm back. So this is what the skirt is looking like now that I stitched the seam allowance on the other side. And I did go ahead and trim down the seam allowance so that it's just 1/4 of an inch the way it is on the other side. So we can get rid of that. Now I am going to measure the elastic and I'm just going to wrap it around my waist where I want the top of the skirt to be. And I'm not stretching it because if I stretch it, that means it's going to create like a muffin top and we don't want that. And then I'm just going to cut right where the loop ends. So there's the excess. And I'm just going to literally like stitch them together like this instead of like doing like this where people overlap it.
I connected the two ends of the elastic and then I slid them underneath the presser foot. I set my machine to a zigzag stitch on the widest width and the longest stitch length, and then I just stitched back and forth about 5 or 6 times. After that, I turned the skirt wrong side out. Then I took the elastic and I lined it up to the top edge around the skirt, and I left about 1/8 of an inch of space of fabric at the top of the skirt, and then I pinned down along the 2 side seams as well as the center front and the center back of the skirt. And my elastic is a bit shorter, but I think that that's going to be okay. Then I lined up the edge of the fabric alongside the blade of the serger machine, and then I just stitched all across. And then I know most people usually fold over the elastic once and then they stitch along the side seams, but I decided that I want to do a double fold. So I pinned it down in place, and I'm just making sure that the elastic is all the way at the top edge of the fabric, and I'm just going to do a straight stitch along the side seams.
This is what the skirt is looking like. Looks pretty good. I'm going to measure the distance between underneath the waistband to the top of the ruffle, and then I'm going to create a casing, and then I'm basically just going to put the casing on top of the side seam and sew down each side of the casing.
So this is how the skirt looks with the casing sewn on. After that, I took my elastic and I put a safety pin on both ends of the elastic, and I just fed it through the casing until I reached the top of the casing. And here you can see the elastic sticking out, so I just pinned down the elastic so that it doesn't get lost. And then I took out the safety pin and I did a straight stitch on top of the elastic so that it will stay in place when I put the skirt on. After that, I took the pin out and you can see the elastic is stitched down in place. After that, I just pulled the elastic through the other end of the casing, and that's the good thing about having the safety pin, is that it's easy to find the bottom of the elastic. Then I just pinned down the elastic so that it won't move, and then I'm going to do a straight stitch on top of the elastic the same way that I did at the top part of the casing. And when I'm done, it looks something like this. And then I'm literally just going to repeat the previous steps with the other casing pattern and the other piece of elastic. And then it looks something like this.
I'd say this skirt is definitely worth the time. DIY it. If I could do anything differently, I would have used more length for the skirt so that when I gathered it, the ruching in the front would be more dramatic, because right now I think it's a little hard to tell that it's actually ruched, but I'm not mad about it. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, ciao!